Something in you has been waiting, not planning, waiting. For the past 4 months, every decision that felt almost ready kept going quiet before you made it. You'd reach the edge and stop. The ground didn't feel right. Tonight is different. At 11:30 p.m. Eastern Time on March 10th, Jupiter stations direct at 15 degrees Cancer. It has been moving backward since November 7th, 2025, 123 days of inward motion through the sign that governs home, belonging, and the emotional bedrock underneath everything else you're building. Tonight, it stops. It turns. This does not happen again, not in Cancer, for another 12 years. Here is what most people miss about this station. The last time Jupiter turned direct in Cancer was March 2014. That spring, a plane disappeared over the Indian Ocean and was never found. The map of Europe changed in a week. And quietly, without headlines, millions of people made the first real decision of their adult lives that came from choice, not from crisis. The pattern repeats. It always does. In the next few minutes, you'll discover 3 things. First, why Jupiter in Cancer doesn't expand what you want. It expands what you're willing to protect. Second, what the Venus-Pluto signal forming at 2:52 a.m. means for anything you've been trying to hold together. Third, what the moment at 11:30 p.m. tonight is actually asking of you, and why it lands differently than anything you've set before. The ground cleared. You're standing on it. Now comes the question of what you plant. Cancer is the only sign in the zodiac where Jupiter operates in exaltation, its highest astrological dignity. Not Taurus, not Leo. Here, and not again for 12 years. But the station itself is not the point. The point is what Jupiter does inside it. Jupiter in Cancer does not expand goals. It does not accelerate plans. It expands the capacity to protect, the ability to hold and defend what you've decided is foundational. Before it shows you where to move, it surfaces what you've been guarding. And what you guard is not always what you consciously chose. The morning after Jupiter stations carries a specific quality. If you stood somewhere in the apartment without knowing why you stopped. If the silence felt different than yesterday, not lighter, different. The body registers this kind of shift before the mind produces language for it. In 2000, a study published in JAMA, Van Cauter et al., documented that after age 50, nighttime cortisol rises at approximately 19 nanomoles per liter per decade. Sleep fragments. The prefrontal cortex, which normally suppresses unresolved emotional material during waking hours, becomes less active in the window between 2 and 4 a.m. Old narratives surface with unusual clarity, not because something is wrong, because the brain is doing exactly what it was built to do, completing what the conscious mind refused to close. There is one protocol for this morning. Do not make a decision. Not yet. Notice what you are protecting. Not what you want. What you are protecting. Name it. That is enough for the next 18 hours. At 5:38 a.m., the moon reached its last quarter in Sagittarius, the sign that governs inner maps, beliefs, and the explanations you've carried for years about why things are the way they are. What it arrived with is more precise than anything you've been prepared for. At 5:38 a.m. Eastern Time on March 11th, the moon reached its last quarter at 20 degrees Sagittarius, forming an exact square to the sun in Pisces. This phase doesn't announce itself, no shift in light, no visible event, but it has a specific function inside every lunar cycle, the moment when what has been carried becomes visible as a structure, not a fact. Sagittarius governs the inner map, the explanations built over years for why things are the way they are. I stay in this because, this is enough because, I can't change course because, these aren't feelings. They are load-bearing beams, architecture so gradual it became invisible. Pisces dissolves categories, the sign where I know and I don't know exist simultaneously. The square between them is not a collision. It is the moment when the map is held against the territory it was supposed to describe and something doesn't match. What most people expect from this phase? Release. What they get is more uncomfortable, visibility. The belief doesn't shatter, it becomes transparent. You can see for the first time in years that it is a structure, not a fact. In March 2014, aviation authorities tracked a disappearing aircraft with the most advanced systems available. For weeks, the map showed where the plane should have been. The plane was not there. What collapsed was not the search. It was the shared assumption that the systems were adequate. The belief did not fail before the system failed. They failed simultaneously. Millions of people discovered that certainty had been performed, not established. Jupiter had entered Cancer less than 4 months prior. This morning, across multiple cities, something quiet happened to a large number of people. A person in London sat down to write a message composed in their head for 8 months and did not send it. A person in Chicago woke before the alarm and stayed still. A person in Seoul opened an old photo album and closed it after a minute, unclear why they had opened it. None of them knew about the last quarter moon. All of them were inside the same geometry. If there is a practice for this window, it is not meditation and not journaling. It is one sentence. Find the sentence in yourself that begins with, I stay because, or this is enough because, or I can't change because. Write it down exactly as it sounds in your head. Then read it as a hypothesis, not as a truth, not as a lie. As a hypothesis someone proposed to you a long time ago, that you adopted, that became structural. You have the right to examine the structure before deciding whether to keep it. The moon has done what Sagittarius does. It named the architecture, but naming is not releasing. At 12:07 a.m. tonight, the moon crosses into Capricorn, the sign of bone, foundation, and the weight of what cannot be avoided. It begins moving through the same degrees where Venus stood 4 days ago. What Venus processed with language and reasoning, the moon now brings to the surface of the body. Without words, without explanation. In the oldest part of you that remembers before you learn to explain anything. At 12:07 a.m. on March 12th, the moon leaves Sagittarius and enters Capricorn. No announcement. A shift in weight, as if something that had been discussed for a long time finally settled onto a surface and stayed there. Capricorn is not the sign of understanding. It is the sign of what actually holds, bone, foundation, the structures that remain after the explanations have been removed. And for the next several hours, the moon moves through the exact degrees where Venus stood 5 days ago, repeating her sequence point by point in an entirely different language. Venus moved through these degrees with reasoning, with the capacity to name, assess, decide. Venus had a choice at each station, see this clearly, or maintain the narrative. The moon has no such capacity. The moon arrives in the body, as sensation, as the texture of something half-remembered, as a thought that surfaces at 3 a.m. without invitation. Between the 4th and 1st centuries BCE, Babylonian astronomers tracked Jupiter's movement not by location alone, but by the geometry of its change in motion. Clay tablets held at the British Museum, reanalyzed in 2016 by historian Mathieu Ossendriver at Humboldt University, revealed trapezoid-shaped graphs, velocity time curves, area under the arc. What they were tracking was not where the planet was, but the precise moment of transition, the station, the turn, the crossing. They understood, 2,300 years before modern astronomy formalized it, repetition of signal on a different frequency carries the same information. The moon crossing Venus's degrees is not coincidence in this system. It is a repetition. The Babylonians would have tracked both, together. At 3:03 a.m., the moon squares Neptune at 1 degree Aries, the exact degree where Venus met Neptune on March 7th, the moment of idealization, of seeing through the particular distortion of wanting something to be true. For Venus, this was a question of choice. For the moon at 3 a.m., there is no question, there is only the body. After 50, with nighttime cortisol elevated and the prefrontal cortex at its most permissive, Neptune at 3 a.m. does not produce confusion. It produces the opposite, a sudden, unasked-for clarity about what you have been calling fine for months, not a conclusion, a recognition. The difference between the two is the difference between deciding something and knowing it. A woman in her late 50s lies awake, not anxious, not afraid, just awake, holding the edge of something she cannot name yet. A man sits with coffee at 4 a.m. he didn't plan to make, None of them know about the moon. All of them are inside the same window, and it will close in a few hours. At 6:21 a.m., the moon squares Saturn at 2 degrees Aries, the degree where Venus stood on March 8th, the weight of what does not bend, what simply is. For Venus, this was honest accounting. For the moon, it arrives as the body registering something that has waited too long. Not as sadness, as heaviness. The specific physical sensation of knowing that what you've been carrying is real. It is yours, and you have been carrying it longer than it was meant to be carried. If you wake between 3 and 7 a.m., and there is a reasonable probability that you will, do not reach for your phone. Notice one thing only, whether what you feel carries the texture of old weight or new weight. That distinction is the only information the next 12 hours are asking you to collect. 3:59 p.m., March 12th, afternoon light, not the middle of the night, not the quiet before dawn, an ordinary moment in an ordinary day. Maybe a kitchen, maybe a bus, maybe a wall you've looked at 100 times this week. At this moment, the moon forms its final square to Venus at 8 degrees Aries. The cycle that opened on March 7th when Venus met Neptune closes here. Not with resolution, with recognition. The distinction matters more than anything that came before it. Resolution means something was solved. Recognition means you stopped arguing with what you already knew. These are not the same event. One of them requires a decision. The other requires only that you stay in the room long enough to let the argument exhaust itself. Venus has moved far from Neptune by now. She passed through Saturn's degree, tested the structure against the weight of what actually holds, and kept moving. She is no longer in idealization and no longer in negotiation. She is in motion. The moon squaring her here is not conflict. It is the body finally catching up to what the mind has already, quietly, accepted. Daniel Kahneman's research on System 1 and System 2 thinking documents what happens when a person carries unresolved emotional material over extended time. System 2, the slow, analytical process, does not spend its energy analyzing. It spends its energy maintaining the narrative that the situation is still undecided. When that maintenance task ends, not because a decision was made, but because the narrative no longer requires defending, System 2 goes quiet. What follows is not clarity. It is silence. A particular kind of silence, the absence of an argument that has been running so long you forgot it was running. There is grief research documentation of something called narrative exhaustion. The moment when the brain, after years of sustaining a story that no longer accurately describes reality, stops generating the energy required to maintain the contradiction. Researchers at the University of California found this most frequently in people between 48 and 62. It does not arrive as a decision. It arrives as a specific kind of fatigue, the kind that feels like finally sitting down after standing for too long. Not weakness, architecture, the brain closing an open loop, 3:59 p.m. The body does nothing unusual, but something shifts, as when you've been holding something in your hand for so long you forgot you were holding it, and then you notice your fingers have already relaxed. You never decided to let go. It simply happened. Between 3:58 and 4 o'clock. This is where the sky stops speaking and the body takes over. There is no protocol for this moment. One instruction only. Do not reach for an explanation of what you're feeling. The cycle that opened March 7th does not need your interpretation. It needs your presence. If something shifts in your chest, in your shoulders, in the quality of the silence around you, let it shift. You do not need to name it. You do not need to act on it. The first action comes later. At 4:15 p.m., 16 minutes from now, the moon forms a sextile to Mars in Pisces, not a push, not a command. The first breath after a long hold, the distinction between that and a decision is everything. 16 minutes, that is the interval between the cycle closing and the first signal that movement is possible again. Not an hour, not a day. 16 minutes after the moon squared Venus at 3:59 p.m., it formed a sextile to Mars in Pisces. In any other sequence, this aspect would be unremarkable. In this one, the timing is the entire point. Mars in Pisces is not Mars in Aries. It does not push, it does not insist. It moves through sensation, the instinctive step that arrives before the decision is made, the first motion that comes not from strategy, but from the sudden absence of what was blocking motion. This Mars does not announce direction. It restores the capacity to move. In 2010, researchers at Columbia University's Department of Psychology documented what they called the post-resolution motor readiness effect. After extended periods of carrying unresolved emotional material, the moment cognitive disengagement occurs, when the brain stops maintaining a narrative that no longer holds, is consistently followed by a measurable increase in behavioral activation. Not a decision, a readiness. Subjects described it not as knowing what to do, but as feeling like they could move, finally. The body, freed from the energy cost of sustaining a contradictory story, redirects that energy outward. This is what Mars in Pisces at 4:15 p.m. carries, not an answer, a readiness. From 11:30 p.m. on March 10th, when Jupiter stopped moving backward, to 4:15 p.m. on March 12th, 41 hours elapsed. In those 41 hours, a last quarter moon named a belief. The moon crossing into Capricorn brought the unconscious through the same degrees where Venus had stood. Neptune at 3 a.m. showed what you'd been calling fine. Saturn at 6 a.m. showed the weight of it. Venus at 3:59 p.m. completed the circuit, and 16 minutes later, the first signal that the cleared ground is ready. 41 hours, not by design, by geometry. By 4:15 p.m., across multiple cities, something very small is happening to a very large number of people. Someone sends a message that has been sitting in drafts since November. Someone opens a document that hasn't been opened in 6 months. Someone books a flight without a clear reason. None of these actions is large. None of them is irreversible. But each carries the particular quality of a first move made from cleared ground, not from crisis, not from pressure, not from someone else's timeline. If there is an action that wants to happen between 4 and 6 p.m. today, do not make it large. Mars in Pisces does not operate at scale. It operates at precision, one action, the smallest one that is actually true, not the one that demonstrates seriousness, the one that costs the least explanation, and feels, despite everything, like the honest next move. Do not announce it. Do not explain it. The scale comes later, when Jupiter builds it. Tonight, one step on cleared ground. The ground cleared. The first step happened, or will happen, or is already forming somewhere inside you before the foot even lifts. What remains after this is not a decision tree and not a roadmap. 7 days from now, a new moon forms in Pisces at 28 degrees, the last breath before the astrological year resets. What you release in this window doesn't disappear. It becomes the material the next cycle is built from. The evening of March 12th. Nothing resolved on the outside. The same walls, the same tasks waiting for tomorrow. But the body carries itself slightly differently, the way a person carries themselves after setting down a bag they've been holding on one shoulder for so long they forgot it was there. Not finding the destination. Simply putting it down. The shoulder remembers what it felt like before the weight. 6 days remain until the new moon. On March 18th at 9:23 p.m. Eastern Time, a new moon forms at 28 degrees and 26 minutes of Pisces, the final degrees of the final sign of the zodiac year. The sun enters Aries on March 20th. What occurs on the 18th is not a beginning. It is the last exhale before the breath resets. This new moon is not quiet by nature. The sun and moon meet in a stellium. Mercury, Mars, and the North Node, all in Pisces simultaneously. Everything that has moved through this sign in recent months converges in a single window. But here is what the structure of this week makes visible. Saturn left Pisces. Neptune left Pisces. The two planets that defined the atmosphere of this sign for years, structure and dissolution, weight and fog, have both crossed into Aries. They are gone. Pisces on March 18th is not the sign of confusion or idealization it was 12 months ago. It is a room after the furniture has been moved out, empty, clean, ready. What you release in this window does not vanish. It becomes the cleared ground the next cycle starts from. Here is the full geometry of what moved across these 6 days. Venus met Neptune on March 7th, idealization given the language of a new beginning. Venus met Saturn on March 8th, that language tested against what actually holds. Jupiter stationed direct on March 10th at 11:30 p.m. The space opened. The last quarter moon named the belief standing in that space. Through the early hours of March 12th, the moon repeated Venus's path in the body, Neptune at 3 a.m., Saturn at 6 a.m. At 3:59 p.m., the cycle completed without resolution. 16 minutes later, the first movement. 6 days later, a new moon at the last degree of the last sign. This is not a collection of separate events. It is a single sequence, one preparation, one readiness, one cleared ground. Between now and March 18th, there is one practice that belongs to this window. Not journaling, not ceremony. One night this week, sit quietly, no screen, no input, for 5 minutes. Notice what no longer needs defending, not what you've decided, what has simply gone quiet on its own. That quietness is the cleared ground. You don't need to tell the new moon what to plant in it. It will know. You have lived through cycles like this before. You know the particular quality of a moment when you stop arguing with what you already know. It is not dramatic. It rarely is. It feels more like tiredness, the kind that comes when you finally put something down. You don't have to decide what comes next tonight. Tonight is not for decisions. Tonight is for the quiet that comes after the argument ends. What you bring into the next cycle and what you leave here, that is the only question. You already know the answer.